compensation. And could we zoom in on those two paragraphs, please, Lawrence? Thank you. So Mr Dowden says this: there was a call from a number of attendees for the government to pay compensation now, following the model adopted in the Republic of Ireland. The Parliamentary Undersecretary and I reaffirmed the government's current position on this issue, namely that we should wait until the inquiry reports before considering compensation. One campaigner asked ministers to consider their proposal on a framework for compensation prior to the inquiry reporting. I have asked my officials and officials in the Department of Health and Social Care to consider this proposal. Now, you then took over the next day. Can I ask, first of all, what was your understanding once you'd taken over and been briefed in due course on the inquiry, of the rationale for what was described as the government's current position, namely wait until the inquiry reports before considering compensation?
So I think that this is reference to largely how we make decisions in government. So we would have a position on something, and then it would only be after work had been done and there'd been a right around and all departments had given the thumbs up to a particular course of action that we would be pursuing that. So I think this is stating and reassuring the addressee on that we haven't deviated from an existing government position. So that's my understanding of that.
And that I understand, but do you recall being told anything as to why at that point in time, so I'm not dealing with the current day's position, why at that point in time the government's position was not to heed the calls of Dame Diana Johnson, but to simply wait and see what the inquiry had to say?
So I don't think I was really given a briefing about how that historic position had been arrived at. What I felt is that as much concurrent activity we could do would be a good thing, and that it, because I think everyone was aware of the time pressures and the financial hardship and other things that people were enduring, that's why I took a different approach, but it certainly wasn't an approach that was met with resistance.
And we'll pick that up, but we can see in the second paragraph then the reference to a proposal on a framework for compensation prior to the inquiry reporting, and that's the issue that you then took up.
Correct.
Is that right? And if we can then just, so that's February 2020, if we can then just look at a document from June 2020, Lawrence, it's JEVA 40223, please. And if we just go to the second page, first of all, so we can see this is a letter from you, back to the first page, dated the 23rd of June 2020, to one of the campaigners who had been at that January meeting, Mr. Evans. In the first paragraph, I think there's a reference to well, you say this: I apologise unreservedly for the lack of communication you've received since the roundtable meeting you attended on the 28th of January. As you know, I've recently assumed responsibility for sponsoring the inquiry, and my team are working with their colleagues in the Cabinet Office to ensure that this does not happen again. Do you know why there had been that lack of compensation, the lack of communication?
Yes, so I was not aware of outstanding correspondence, and why I felt the need to make that apology. As I assumed the role, it was right at the very start of the pandemic response, and a lot of my first weeks and few months in the role were very focused on that, and I had not been briefed by my private office team about outstanding correspondence. When I discovered that, we went to great efforts to make sure that was dealt with very swiftly.
And then if we can just look at the third paragraph of the letter, you say this: regarding the ongoing call for compensation which you support, as you know, at the meeting in January, ministers agreed to consider a request to look at a framework for compensation before the inquiry reports. I want to assure you that I'm committed to this, along with taking forward the actions agreed to address the disparities in financial and non-financial support for those infected and affected across the UK. I met with Minister Dorries last month to discuss this and am actively seeking ways to move forward with the actions agreed at the January meeting. My officials will update you in due course. So at this point in time, late June 2020, what was it that you were committed to as recorded in this letter?
So I think there were two key aspects. The first was with regard to existing support schemes. I was aware of problems with those, particularly that they were not on par with one another. And so that was one piece of work I wanted to address. And then with regard to the compensation study, I wanted to establish that as swiftly as possible.
So if we then turn to a letter you then wrote on the 13th of July 2020, so 3 weeks or so after this letter, EIBS 40706, please, Lawrence. So it's a letter dated the 13th of July 2020, and it's addressed to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who was then Rishi Sunak. You explain that you're writing as the sponsoring Minister of the Infected Blood Inquiry, and then there's an update on the progress of the inquiry. If we just look first of all under the heading Funding the Inquiry, you say there successive sponsoring ministers have committed publicly to supporting the completion of the inquiry's work as quickly as thoroughness allows. This work remains urgent for many victims. And then this: justice delayed is justice denied as the fallout from this tragedy continues to claim lives. So would it be right to understand from that that you were aware by this time that people were continuing to die as a result of what had happened to them?
Yes.
And you were bringing that here to the attention of the Treasury. If the Treasury was hitherto unaware of it, you were telling them in terms that was the position?
Yes.
And would it be fair to say you'd expect anyone in government with a working knowledge of the infected blood inquiry or the infected blood scandal to understand that this wasn't just a matter of historical injustice, that people were continuing to suffer and continuing to die?
Yes.
There's then a heading Financial Support. That deals with the issue of disparities, and I'm not going to ask you about that. But if we could go, please, to the next page. We have the heading Compensation, and I'm just going to read that aloud for the benefit of those listening and watching, and then come back to some of what you say. So onto the heading Compensation for Victims. In the first paragraph, you refer to Mr. Dowden's letter to the Prime Minister, which we just looked at. Then you say this: I fully expect the inquiry chair, Sir Brian Langstaff, to make recommendations about levels of financial support, and I believe it to be inevitable that the government will need to provide substantial compensation. The costs are likely to be high. For example, the Compensation Tribunal established in the Republic of Ireland paid out €743 million between 1996 and 2018. I believe we should begin preparing for this now, before the inquiry reports, and my officials are working with DHSC colleagues to consider approaches to compensation. Any decision on compensation will require careful consideration. Experience of other inquiries suggests that early action could save the government significant legal costs, as well as provide victims with compensation as soon as possible. The inquiry cannot make determinations on liability, but its recommendations and findings could be a springboard for civil or criminal cases which could determine liability. I believe the best arrangement would be to view this scheme as part of the NHS's existing compensation schemes. This gives us the potential to avoid one-off costs or funding to deliver a scheme. I would like to discuss the merits of doing this work with your officials as soon as possible. I will keep you and other interested ministers updated on progress. I've copied this letter to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Health and the Health Ministers of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. If we can just have the full section, Lawrence, on compensation. Thank you. So I just want to ask you a little more about some of what you said here, Ms Mordaunt. In the paragraph, the second paragraph under the heading Compensation for Victims, you say, I believe it to be inevitable that the government will need to provide substantial compensation. Now, those are powerful words, inevitable, substantial. What had led you to this conclusion by this stage?
Well, prior to taking the role, obviously I was aware of the situation facing people just from having been a Member of Parliament. And I think my readout via my private office and officials who were dealing with this, particularly from that January meeting that my predecessor had, I think things were really pointing towards that being an inevitable outcome from this. So what I was keen to ensure is that, again, government recognised that, and that where we could undertake activity concurrent with this inquiry, that we should do so.
You then suggest the costs are likely to be high, and then if we just go to the next paragraph, you say, I believe we should begin preparing for this now before the inquiry reports, and you refer to work between your officials and DHSC colleagues. Was one purpose of raising the issue at this stage and raising it in these terms, so telling the Treasury that it was both inevitable and likely to be at high cost, was that so that the Treasury could start to make appropriate accommodation and provision at an early stage and not have to scrabble down the back of the Treasury sofa years later?
Yes, I think it is about making sure that all government departments are aware of what is likely to need to happen and prepare for that. I think some of my thinking in this had been coloured from my experiences working at the MOD, where I'd been dealing with compensation issues where if the Ministry of Defence's compensation scheme was not adequate enough and people had to take civil action, quite often government was spending more money on legal fees than had it just had a more comprehensive compensation scheme in the first place. And I'd felt that very keenly as Minister of State for the Armed Forces, that we ought to be doing right by people, and actually it was cost effective to do right by people.
And I think we see that picked up in the next paragraph. You identify in that first sentence two advantages to early action. The first, as you say, is a benefit to the government, saving the government significant legal costs. The other is providing victims with compensation as soon as possible. And would it be right to characterise that as the argument rooted in the question of what's right, morality and justice, essentially?
Yes.
And then if we look at the following paragraph, you've suggested this. I believe the best arrangement would be to view this scheme as part of the NHS's existing compensation schemes. Now, I'm not going to ask you chapter and verse on what those existing compensation schemes were. There's an arm's length body called NHS Resolution. That's its current name, and billions of pounds are processed by NHS Resolution every year, including substantial sums for clinical harm. Is that the kind of thing that you had in mind when you were suggesting here that it could be viewed as part of the NHS's existing compensation scheme?
So this wasn't really reference to the body or how any such scheme should be run. It was really reference to the fact that in doing my homework prior to writing this letter, I knew that the NHS had substantial liabilities which perhaps weren't dealt with in terms of government's financial management in the most sensible way. And I think what I wanted to do was to, by including this, give the Treasury some encouragement to grip the issue.
Now, you say in that last sentence of the penultimate paragraph you'd like to discuss the merits of the work with Treasury, with the Chancellor's officials as soon as possible, and then we see reference in the final paragraph to who the letter was copied to. Did you receive any response from the Chancellor to this letter?
I didn't receive a written response.
Did you receive a non-written response?
So there was discussions between officials, but I didn't have a formal written response from him.
Is that unusual for a minister not to reply to another minister's letter dealing with such a weighty matter as this?
In other times it would be. I would not in other times expect a substantial reply, but normally you would receive an acknowledgement. During this period, it was a pretty chaotic situation in government, particularly with 3 departments, Treasury, Health and Education. And if you look, it's in the public domain, at the correspondence response times for those 3 departments, I think at the time they were lingering around 30% responding. So I think it was at times of great strain on the parliamentary clerks and normal correspondence. These were not normal periods of time. However, I did get, there was a channel of communications between my officials and Treasury officials, and of course I continued to follow up.
If we look at the follow-up letter that you wrote, it's at EIBS 0000705. So this is the 21st of September 2020, and again, it's to Mr. Sunak in his capacity as Chancellor of the Exchequer. You say, I'm writing to update on the infected blood inquiry as promised in my letter of the 13th of July, specifically our commitments on financial support and compensation. And then there is a discussion under the heading financial support of measures to address disparities across the UK in the levels of financial support provided by the 4 devolved schemes. If we then go to the heading compensation for victims, we can see that you repeat what you'd said in your July letter. I expect Sir Brian to make recommendations about levels of financial support, and it is inevitable that the government will need to provide substantial compensation. The costs are likely to be high, and I firmly believe that we should begin preparing for this now. Again, you're expressing yourself in fairly strong terms. You say you firmly believe that we should begin preparing for this now. Was there a sense that you were having to drive this message home to the Chancellor or to others within government?
I think that's the job of any minister, is that you're trying to do the best you can with the responsibilities you have in your portfolio. And again, this was at a time when, a very unusual time, where there was immense, unusual pressures, particularly on certain departments. So, yes, I wanted to shout loudly. And I think really Treasury engagement here was more about the ability of government to prepare itself. This letter was written whilst we were having ongoing discussions between officials and others on the 2 matters that I've outlined that were the 2 things I particularly wanted to get done.
And if we just turn over the page to complete the letter, you say this, I would also like to meet with you or the Chief Secretary to discuss the Cabinet Office's suggestions for our approach to compensation. I cannot stress enough the urgency of taking long overdue action on financial support and compensation. I've copied this letter to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury and the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State. And then we have a handwritten edition, which is commendably legible, which says, we have ideas about a solution to this and have been trying for some time to secure a meeting with you. It might be said there's a note of frustration creeping into the letter, that this is a matter you regard as important. You want direct engagement with Treasury ministers and you weren't at this stage getting it. Is that fair?
I think the normal routes where you would be able to see a minister were not available to us at this time. So during the course of normal parliamentary business, you in voting lobbies and other places, you'd be bumping into colleagues, you'd be able to speak to them directly. This was a period of time where we didn't have those options, and we were largely driven by correspondence and private office to private office discussions. So yes, it was a stressful period in terms of trying to push things forward, particularly that weren't directly related to the pandemic response.
And taking what you've said here at face value, your view was that action on compensation was, by this time, September 2020, long overdue. In other words, something that should have been addressed before this time. That would be the normal reading, is that fair?
Yes, I think that is fair. This has been going on for a very long time.
And was urgent and needed to be addressed.
Yes, I think there's two things about this letter that the handwritten note, what I was referring to there was really about how government might best prepare, how with a view to that other issue of other liabilities the National Health Service had. But I very much felt that people had been waiting a very long time. They'd been waiting a long time for this inquiry. They had been waiting a long time to get their issues addressed. And there was a moral responsibility, this being our shift, to do that.
You did not, as I understand it, receive a substantive response to this letter, a substantive written response. I think Mr. Sunak's statement suggests there was a holding response. Is that correct?
I think that is correct, yes.
Did you have any response at all, either from the Chancellor or from the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, who I think at that stage was probably Steve Barclay?
So I did of sorts, not formal correspondence, but there were three things that I was particularly trying to get done: establish the compensation inquiry to address the parity of support across the four nations, and also mentioned in an earlier letter there was some resource that this inquiry needed to continue, and wanted that done in a particular way. And on all three of those matters, I was able to take them forward. So we had response from those departments. I could not have progressed with those things had I not got sign-off and a positive response from a right around in Whitehall.
You say in your witness statement, if we just put it up on screen, Lawrence, it's WITN 7701001, and it's paragraph 9. So picking it up in the third line, you say, I believe that I had the best chance of getting both the Treasury and the Department of Health to grip the issues if they saw them as part of a wider problem they had to solve, namely other liabilities they were carrying. Could you just explain what your thinking was in relation to that, what you mean in that part of your statement?
So as I stated earlier, in looking at how the Department of Health approached those liabilities it might have for compensation and injury and redress of injury that the NHS might have to do, it didn't have necessarily the smartest way, in my view, of approaching those particular issues. What I didn't want to have this appear to be was another large problem and no preparation for it. So that's why I wanted to particularly have a meeting with the Treasury to suggest some ways that they might approach this issue, but also that might help them with other issues that the NHS was facing.
And were you able to have such a meeting?
No, I was not.
And did you get any answer as to why?
I think it was, I didn't get any, as I've stated, any formal response, but I know that the bandwidth of those departments was very stretched during the pandemic.
Could we then just look at JEVA 0000229. This is a short letter you wrote 24th of December 2020, so 3 months or so after your second letter to the Chancellor, again to a campaigner, and you say in the last paragraph, I want to assure you that of all the responsibilities I have, this issue is the most fundamental. I'll do everything I can to ensure people are properly supported and that the government meets its commitment to consider a framework for compensation. Now, it's just that first sentence in the paragraph I wanted to ask you about, Ms. Mordaunt. Again, powerful words. I want to assure you that of all the responsibilities I have, this issue is the most fundamental. What was it that led you to think that way about this issue?
Because I think this is an unprecedented situation. As you've already noted, I've been a Member of Parliament since 2010, and in that time we've had all kinds of inquiries into people with learning disabilities in care homes, or the Hillsborough disaster, many tragic things that Parliament has had to grip. But I think this is absolutely unprecedented, the length of time that people have had to wait, really issues and things that people have had to deal with that are very difficult to understand. So I think that I'm pleased that we set up this inquiry, and I think it was very evident what we needed to do, not necessarily all of the details, but I think the reason why the inquiry was set up is that people who were in Parliament and in government at the time felt this was an issue that needed to be dealt with, and time was very, very pressing, even though activity was happening in a much more profound way than it had for many, many years preceding it. We still had that responsibility to move at pace.
And then can I then turn to the announcement that you made then in March 2021 of the compensation framework study. So Lawrence, if we could have please RLIT 00014988. This is a statement from you, 25th of March 2021. The first part of the statement deals with the issue of parity. I'm not going to read through that. If we go to the next page, we have the heading Compensation Framework. And you say this under that heading: to meet the government's commitment to consider a framework for compensation, we can confirm our intention to appoint an independent reviewer to carry out a study looking at options for a framework for compensation and to report back to the Paymaster General with recommendations before the inquiry reports. Terms of reference will be finalised in consultation between the independent reviewer and those infected and affected. The study will include compensation of the scope and levels of such compensation, consideration of the scope and levels of such compensation and the relationship between the compensation framework and the existing financial support schemes in place. The study is entirely separate from the public inquiry, which continues to have this government's full support. It will not duplicate the work of the inquiry or cut across the inquiry's findings. The study shall provide the Paymaster General with advice on potential compensation framework design and solutions which can be ready to implement upon the conclusion of the inquiry should the inquiry's findings and recommendations require it. Now, this is late March 2021, so that's roughly 6 months after your second letter to the Chancellor, 8 months since your July letter, 14 months since the matter had been raised at that January 2020 meeting with your predecessor. Is that lapse of time consistent, looking at it now, with the urgency of taking long overdue action?
So I think that if you were to look at whether it be box notes or discussions that had been going on between my officials and the devolved administrations, I think you would have seen weekly activity. There were no, I do not think, fallow periods where we were not working on this. To get the 4 schemes working in parity, that took a lot of work from my officials, all very positive engagement, but there were quite a number of issues that needed to be thrashed out. And in terms of the compensation study, we needed to get right-arounds cleared and so forth. I think, again, this was against a backdrop of immense activity on that all-consuming issue of the pandemic. So I think that that was a factor in terms of speed of response to things, but I think not an unreasonable one, given how much bandwidth that issue was absorbing in government. But again, from memory, and I think this will be borne out in my diary and box notes, this was work that was ongoing and pressing.
I can understand the question of financial parity between the 4 schemes might involve matters of detail that would require consideration and discussion and deliberation against, as you say, a backdrop of course, the pandemic and the constraints that placed. Did the question of commissioning someone to produce a study on options for a compensation framework, that's quite a simple question. Did that get lost in dealing with the pandemic, or just sidelined because you were focusing on parity? I don't mean you personally, I mean the government more generally.
I think there was an order that we were trying to address those 3 issues, and things are always more complicated than you first expect. So, for example, just on resourcing this inquiry, we had to have, it wasn't just a case of here you are, off you go. It was a case of having to justify how the inquiry would continue to be staffed. So there was quite a lot of pressure, for example, to have civil servants provide, and part of the government's legal team provide particular support. That, in my view, was not appropriate, and the inquiry needed to continue as it had been being staffed. So sometimes what appear to be quite simple decisions require quite a lot of lobbying internally to get the right outcome. It's not just one meeting that is needed to get the right outcome. The establishment of the compensation framework itself was quite a complicated thing to do, because what we needed to think through was how that would square with this inquiry. I've already stated why I felt very strongly that we needed to do concurrent activity. It was always a possibility the inquiry might want interim payments made to people. But what we needed was there to be both pieces of work having a reference to each other whilst being independent. And there was certainly quite a bit of discussion at official level between how the compensation study would interact with this inquiry. Could one make reference to another during the course of their work, and so forth. So these are, they were quite complicated things to work out the best course of action with. And of course, wanting to try and retain the confidence of those infected and affected throughout.
Looking at it now, with the benefit of hindsight, do you think it took too long to get to the stage of commissioning the framework study?
So I think that everything about the situation has taken too long. In my shift as Paymaster General, I do not think we could have worked faster in thrashing out and dealing with some of these issues. What I also did throughout the course, as well as corresponding with people to keep them informed, I attended the all-party group that was concerned with this to try and keep them updated. And one of the things I remember saying to that group, because, for example, when we announced certain things about the schemes and putting them on parity, there were still other issues that people needed us to deal with. And what I explained to the all-party parliamentary group is that as a minister, you don't know how long you have in a job. When I became Secretary of State for Defence, I had 85 days in the job. There is no way you slow down what it is you're trying to get done. And I explained to them that the reason why I'd made announcements but not others is I wasn't going to wait until I'd delivered on the other things I knew were concerned to them. I wanted to get things out the door as quickly as possible. And certainly I know from the officials I was working with, that is how they felt as well.
Now, Sir Robert Francis KC was duly appointed by you to undertake the study. There's a consultation on the terms of reference, and he reported to you his recommended terms of reference. If we could just briefly look at those. They are at RLIT 0002083. This is the ministerial announcement by your successor by this point in time, Mr. Ellis, 23rd of September. I'm not going to read through the terms of reference, but if we just look further down the page, we can see the third paragraph says, Sir Robert's recommendations identify the key issues that the study should consider. They offer assurance to the infected and affected communities that the matters of most concern to them will be considered by the study. I'm therefore happy to accept Sir Robert's recommendations in full, and I'm today publishing the following terms of reference without amendment. And then we see the terms of reference there set out. As I say, I'm not going to read through them, but you've got the various headings, and they continue over the page. And we'll see they deal with the categories of injury loss, types of award, method of assessment, and so on. Now, although it fell to your successor to formally approve and publish the terms of reference, you had, I think, seen them before you left office. And if we just look at RLIT 0002081, please. This is Michael Ellis, your successor as Paymaster General, to Sir Robert Francis, in relation to the terms of reference, but we can see in a second paragraph there's reference to Mr. Ellis's predecessor, so to you. I share my predecessor's view that your recommendations identify the key issues that the study should consider and that they offer assurance to the infected and affected communities that the matters of most concern to them will be considered by the study. So is it right to understand that, having seen the terms of reference, they were essentially what you had had in mind in commissioning this piece of work in the first place?
Yes, I think there's two things I would say which I think are very relevant here. We had a draft set of terms of reference that were produced, and clearly wanted to consult on those to make sure that they were going to really do the job and that we'd captured everything we needed to. I was very keen that that consultation did not run into months and months and months, and so had pushed back on asks from those affected that I didn't want an enormous amount of legal toing and froing, and we came to, through discussion, I think, between my officials and key lawyers who were acting for particular groups, that we would be able to do this swiftly. So I think that's an example of where we were trying to keep the pace on, trying to retain the confidence of people that had been affected by this, and ensuring that we were going to end up with a good set of terms of references that had everyone's confidence, but not wanting it to run into a very lengthy period of time. And I felt that it was, although people would have wanted legal representation to do that, it was something that people should have confidence in. We were trying to get to a good set of terms of reference, and I think that is what we achieved. And I think that that Sir Robert originally came back to my office with the set of recommendations, and I think it was a couple of weeks, we were in recess, but a couple of weeks, and I'd gone back to him to say that I thought they were a good set of terms and conditions, of terms of reference.
If we could just go back to the announcement you'd made in March 2021 of the intention to appoint someone to do the study. So back to RLIT 00001498, please, Lawrence, page 2. And again, if we can just zoom in under the heading compensation framework. So the second paragraph under that heading compensation framework, the second sentence says this: the study shall provide the Paymaster General with advice on potential compensation framework design and solutions. And then it's these words I want to ask you about: which can be ready to implement upon the conclusion of the inquiry, should the inquiry's findings and recommendations require it. Now, the phrase "ready to implement upon the conclusion of the inquiry" I would suggest, in terms of timing, that you were not envisaging some prolonged period of time following the conclusion of the inquiry, rather that you would have something ready to go if the inquiry recommended compensation. Is that fair?
Correct.
We know, so we can take that down, thank you, Lawrence. We know from evidence the inquiry has heard from the then Secretary of State for Health, Matt Hancock, in, I think it was May 2021 when he gave evidence to the inquiry. He said that if the inquiry recommended compensation, the government would pay it. That was his expectation. Was that your expectation too?
Yes.
Now, I'm not going to take you through the detail then of what the government has or hasn't done in response to Sir Robert's framework study, or indeed the inquiry's second interim report, because you are not the minister who's been dealing with that. That's for later witnesses this week. Can I just explore with you a little your expectations in commissioning the study as to what might then be done with it? So if we take up your statement, WITN 7701,001, and if we go, please, Lawrence, to page 5, paragraph 21. It's the bottom of the page. You say this: I've been asked what my expectation was when commissioning the study as to what the government would do once it received the study report. As is set out in the report, the study would be submitted to the government and the inquiry, and it would set out recommendations together with advice on options for the government on a compensation framework design. So you've set out there two expectations: that the report would be submitted to the government and the report would be submitted to the inquiry. But what was your expectation as to what the government itself would do with the report of Sir Robert Francis when it arrived?
So I think that the government would clearly be following both pieces of work. My view was that we should, again, try and do as much activity as we could concurrently with the inquiry. At the conclusion of this inquiry, there would be potentially factors that would have an impact on what type of scheme or the amounts that would be paid out. So that is why I had said that that it would be action that would be taken at the conclusion of this inquiry. There was always the possibility that during the course of this inquiry, given time pressures, there might be recommendations for interim payments. But what I wanted to ensure was that we would not have a situation where this inquiry would conclude and then work on how we were going to deliver on those recommendations would start. So that was, I was very open as the Minister as to what the compensation inquiry should conclude. That was really the task of that study. But what I wanted to do was ensure that whatever preparatory work, issues to be considered, further evidence to be taken, that was done concurrently to this inquiry.
So again, I'm conscious you cease to be the responsible minister, but so putting it in broad terms, was it your expectation that once the compensation study had been delivered to the Cabinet Office, the government would look at it as a matter of urgency and would start work on whatever was required to enable there to be set up as soon as practicable a scheme for compensation?
Simply, yes. It's obviously possible that Sir Robert's work, there might be areas of disagreement with the inquiry, but when we set up the compensation study, it was very clear that both the study and the inquiry could make reference to each other. They were independent from one another, but not in their own bubble, and that those areas of disagreement, the chances of them being minimised through that process was there. Clearly, there may be some more work for government to do. You note I'm not cited on that. But there may be areas of disagreement that government needs to take a decision on. But my motivation for doing this was to ensure that that time period would be minimised.
And was it your expectation that the government's response to Sir Robert's study would be published and shared with the inquiry so that the inquiry had the benefit of considering it?
Yes, I think that relationship between the two was important.
If we go back to...
Well, may I just ask, could we just have the highlighted part that was on the screen back on the screen? Thank you. You were anticipating that Sir Robert's work would end up with an advice on options for the government on a compensation framework design. May I ask you two things about that? Options means choices, and it's the nature of government to make choices between alternatives, is it? Generally.
Yes.
So the purpose of this was that there would be choices, and some would be preferred choices, and that would be done, you anticipated, in advance of the inquiry making its final report.
Yes.
And the options were not options as to how much, but as to the framework that was to deliver it.
The framework, and I think also things that the government perhaps needed to consider when doing so, yes.
Yes, obviously a framework doesn't just sit on its own, it's got to do something. But you were anticipating these would be choices about how to deliver whatever had to be delivered.
Yes.
Thank you.
And then if we could just look at paragraph 14 of your statement, so that's page 4, please, Lawrence. This is, again, by reference to your expectations. You say you decided it was sensible to seek independent advice. Compensation framework study should be set up to provide independent advice to the government regarding the design of a workable and fair framework for compensation for individuals infected and affected by the infected blood scandal. And is it your view that, broadly speaking, I'm not talking here about points of detail or points potentially of difference, but broadly speaking, that what Sir Robert Francis delivered fulfilled that aim of providing advice regarding the design of a workable and fair framework for compensation?
Yes.
Now, since you expressed the view in 2020 that substantial compensation was inevitable, clearly two key things have happened. Sir Robert Francis' study has completed and made recommendations for compensation to the infected and affected. And the government has received the first and second reports interim reports of this inquiry, which makes recommendations of substantial compensation for the infected and affected. Is it fair to assume that nothing has happened that would change your view that substantial compensation is inevitable?
Yes, that's correct.
Can I then ask you to look just at something that you said in Parliament in May of 2021? So if we have, please, Lawrence, RLIT 0002075, please. And so we can see the date, 27th of May 2021, and if we could go to the third page, the bottom half of the page, there's a question from Jessica Mordaunt MP, and then a response from you. So if we could just zoom in on those two paragraphs, please. Thank you, Lawrence. So Ms Mordaunt says this: there are real concerns that bereaved parents who lost their children to the contaminated blood scandal could be omitted from future compensation packages for victims, as they were with the ex gratia payments. I've written to the Paymaster General about this. Will she please meet with me and the Smith family, who tragically lost their son Colin, aged just 7. This is about acknowledging their loss, and it's the very least they deserve given the injustices that they have endured. And the inquiry knows that's a reference to Mr and Mrs Smith, from whom the inquiry heard in 2019, whose son Colin was infected with HIV and who they watched die of AIDS aged just 7 years old. And the inquiry knows, and I no doubt Ms Mordaunt, you do too, of other children who died. Your response then, you say, I'm very happy to meet the young lady and any of the victims of this appalling scandal. I raised this issue at the recent meeting of the all-party parliamentary group on haemophilia and contaminated blood. And I want to let all those people who have lost children know that just because we published the written ministerial statement which made reference to other support for other individuals, that does not mean that they are not at the forefront of our minds. The compensation study that we recently announced will obviously be looking at many of the issues that they've raised, but I would be happy to meet them. Can we take from that, Ms Mordaunt, that you would agree that those individuals who lost children, whose children died the most horrible deaths before their time, that they should be at the forefront of the government's mind when it considers how to deliver long overdue justice?
Yes, and this makes reference to what I said earlier. It is you do not know how long you have in a role, and so when you make announcements, you want to make them as quickly as possible. You want to get any progress that you have made on these issues out the door, and sometimes that means that they're not accompanied with other issues that you're still working on. And I feel this very keenly because I know there's a very wide range of people that have been affected in many different ways from this, and that this is an issue where, in addition to the original tragedy, there has been layer on layer of difficulties people have had to face, and that's why these issues are complicated, and this inquiry is important. So again, I was trying to reassure people in that category that we hadn't forgotten about them. It's just that we had been able to make progress on other areas.
And you were aware, I think, when you were Paymaster General, that if we leave aside the position of bereaved partners, where what was available in terms of financial support has changed over time, but other family members, so parents whose children had died, such as Mr. and Mrs. Smith, or children whose parents had died, sometimes both parents, that they had not received financial support and were still not receiving financial support.
Yes, yes.
And again, and this is a question again in very broad terms, drawing on your own knowledge and views about the matter from when you were Paymaster General. Would you agree that the position of those people who've received little or nothing in the past should be at the forefront of the government's mind?
Yes, I think that there's clearly been some support for particular groups of people, but there hasn't been these issues looked at in terms of compensation. So for very understandable reasons, the issue of support to particular groups of people has been more pressing for several governments. But this inquiry, the compensation study that sits alongside it, this is the moment to address those other matters.
Can I, before I just ask you a handful of more general matters, can I just ask you something about lack of parity, so disparity? You obviously had some close involvement with questions of financial disparities across the four nations, and I'm not proposing to ask you about the detail of that, and those have to some extent been examined in earlier inquiry hearings in any event. But you obviously, we can see from a lot of the material we've looked at, you regarded it as important to try and correct those disparities, and you regarded them as, again, in broad terms, wrong in principle, that there should be disparities in financial support across the four nations.
Yes, and I think that in addition to levelling up, to coin a phrase, those schemes, the agreement that was also arrived at that any changes to those schemes, the four nations would move in step, was an important principle. And I think that whatever is put in place regarding future frameworks, how that is administered nationally across four nations or locally within the four nations, that principle is important.
Now, one disparity that remains between the four nations is in relation to a form of non-financial support, specialist psychological support, which is available now in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, but not in England. And you may know that that was the subject of one of the recommendations in the Chair's second interim report. Again, I'm not asking you about the detail of what current consideration is being given to that issue. But given your previous involvement in addressing disparities, is that continuing lack of disparity in terms of psychological support something that, to your mind, is a cause for concern?
So, when I was dealing with this, one of the things, and again it was addressed in my WMS tabled, was around that psychological support. I'm afraid at the moment I wouldn't know the detail of the offer that is provided to people, but I know this is an issue that has been historically an issue of concern to people. And so whilst things might be delivered in different ways across the different NHS systems that we have in the UK, of course I would want to ensure people are being properly supported.
Can I then take you to a speech that was given by Andy Burnham in Parliament in 2017, and obviously before you became involved as responsible minister, but it's a useful way of capturing some of the concerns that people have had. So if we go to RLIT 0002074, please. We'll see this is Mr Burnham, 25th of April 2017, and this was his last speech in the House. And as we see from the first paragraph, he had elected to make it on the subject of contaminated blood, and he explains in that paragraph why, and indeed he's told the inquiry in his evidence why. If we could just scroll down to the next two paragraphs, please. In the paragraph beginning first, let me explain the genesis of my speech. Mr Burnham refers to the work of Diana Johnson, and then says this in the third line: there was a raising of expectations in the last Parliament. I'm talking about a lot of goodwill on both sides of the House, and a sense that people wanted to do something to help. That continued in the early part of this Parliament with a sense building that something was going to be done. However, following those expectations, victims now feel that they've been led up to the top of the hill only to be let down once again. And then if we go towards the bottom of the page, give me while I find the right reference. Yes, sorry, it's the following paragraph. Although I do not doubt the sincerity of the former Prime Minister's apology at his last PMQs, the government's failure to back it with substantial action has left people feeling in the wilderness all over again. So if I can just ask you to keep in mind, I'm going to show you another passage and then ask you a couple of questions, but what Mr Burnham was there characterising, victims feeling they've been led up to the top of the hill only to be let down once again, and then the failure to back with substantial action leaving people feeling in the wilderness all over again. And then before we leave this document, if we just go to page 7, and it's, if we look first of all at Mr Burnham's first speech towards the top of the page, if we could just zoom in on that, he talks about how the whole thing's about finance. It's always been about finance and about whether we can give them a bit more. And then, last sentence of that paragraph, people are still struggling, and I hope they will not have to struggle for much longer. And in context, I think he's talking there about struggling financially, in part at least. And then if we go to the very bottom of the page, sorry, if we just look at the paragraph before, just so that, to put it in context, his answer in context, Barbara Keeley refers there to the question of compensation, and a reference to the disgrace of someone having to use their own funding to get treatment. And then Mr Burnham saying it's a total disgrace, and then this, absolutely, there must be full fair compensation now. I say to the government, do not delay, do what Ireland and other countries have done. They should do that now. They have raised expectations and they should do it. We would all support it. Now, given that 6 years after that call, and well over a year after Sir Robert Francis delivered to the government his compensation framework study that you'd commissioned the previous year, I think it's fair to say, based on the inquiry's understanding, that many of the victims of the infected blood disaster, to use Mr Burnham's words, feel they've been led up to the top of the hill only to be let down again. They feel they're in the wilderness all over again. Having regard to that, and to your own sense of long overdue action being needed back in 2020, do you have any observations you feel able to make on the length of time the process of resolving the question of compensation is taking? And again, I'm not asking you to look at sort of detail about what is or isn't being done at the present time, but just generally looking at the overall timescales.
Well, I think there's 2 points I would make with regard to this. I think any minister that comes into the paymaster general role and has this in their portfolio will recognise that this is an issue that has been going on for an incredibly long time. And although in more recent years there's been this inquiry, there's been more focus on these issues, the legacy of that period of time, large swathes of it, where there was very little focus on the many layers of injustices that people had suffered. I think you cannot fail to recognise that in your dealings with those who have been infected and affected by this, and you're very conscious wanting to keep people informed and keep the pace on these matters. I know from my own shift there were some quite complicated things that needed to be worked out in a time of immense stress in government, and I think my private office notes, the drumbeat of meetings will show that there was no let up despite the backdrop we were working against in terms of delivering that. Outside of that role, that has also been my experience of working with other ministers. The role I immediately went into was in trade, and so I had zero dealings with ministers on this issue, but clearly followed what was happening in Parliament. And certainly in this role, where I've had those dealings with the current minister, I have found his attitude towards this the same as mine.
And obviously we'll have the benefits of hearing from him tomorrow. Again, in general terms, if in 2020, as you wrote just over 3 years ago, justice delayed is justice denied, that's no less true, and maybe all the more true now 3 years later. Is that fair?
Yes, I think that there is a moral obligation to address the many issues that those affected by this have, and I'm very conscious that that can't happen soon enough.
And if we can then look at something that you said yourself recently in Parliament on the 25th of May of this year, RLIT 0002127. So we have the date there, and if we could please go to, I think it's page 5, Lawrence. So we can see you're addressing a number of different matters that have been raised. Under the heading Penny Mordaunt, if we can look at the last and longest paragraph of that answer, You say this: the Honourable Lady raises the very serious matter of the infected blood inquiry. I have had the privilege of meeting many of those who were infected and affected by that appalling scandal, and I went to hear some of the evidence that they gave at the inquiry. It may fall to us in this place on our shift to put that right, but we must put it right. There is not just the original injustice that was done to those people, many of whom were children at the time, but the further layers of injustice that have happened with regard to their financial resilience, as many of them lost their homes and were not able to work, facing the appalling stigma and hardship that came with that. We have to put that right. And then you refer to the establishment of the compensation scheme review to run concurrently with the government. When you are talking there about putting it right, you are talking, are you not, in part at least, about compensation?
Yes.
We know the government has publicly accepted the moral case for compensation. Mr Quinn said so in Parliament late last year. Would you agree, again, in general terms, that if the acceptance of a moral case for compensation is not followed by action in providing compensation and doing so without delay, then you are not putting it right?
Yes.
One final question. Again, the inquiry is aware that some, perhaps many, of those who were infected and affected are concerned that the government, in the knowledge that people are dying, intends to kick the question of compensation off into the long grass. Now, I'm not asking you to comment on that as a matter of fact, and I hope other witnesses in the course of this week who are directly dealing with the question of compensation will be able to address that from their perspective. Can I ask you this hypothetical question? If that were the government's position, if there was a conscious dragging of feet on the basis that it's all too complicated or all too expensive, would you agree that given everything that has been suffered by those who were infected and affected, that that would be a morally objectionable, indeed repugnant position to adopt?
Yes, and I think I can say two further things. Again, reiterating, that has not been my experience in my current role. Probably worth explaining that everything that government does when it reaches a stage of decision has to go to a right round. So that's every Whitehall department has to be cited and clear something to move ahead, whether it is a statutory instrument, whether it is a consultation or a piece of legislation. And although you're right to note that the King's speech has not been written, these are matters that are being looked at by the current minister and their team, not me, and we've not reached that stage in government. As leader of the House of Commons, I would anticipate that if future legislation were required for a compensation body or to proceed with that, or any further works to facilitate that, that would be happening. That is the narrow slice that I'm looking at this with my current job. But on both my experience in this job, with regard to the future legislation and in dealings that I've had with the current minister, I do not think there is any delay to moving as quickly as we can on these matters. And it would be pointless to have set up this inquiry and the study not to then proceed with making redress.
Ms Mordaunt, thank you, and obviously those are issues I'll pick up with later witnesses this week. So those are my proposed questions for Ms Mordaunt, and I note the time. If we could take our customary 30-minute break, and if I could invite our legal representatives to, in the normal way, let me know in the course of the break of any further questions they might wish me to consider asking Ms Mordaunt, and then we could resume in 30 minutes, and I think then probably relatively quickly conclude Ms Mordaunt's evidence thereafter.
Well, I think we'll make the break just a shade longer than 30 minutes. We're in unfamiliar territory
Yes.
here. There are a lot of people both in this room and there may be more downstairs watching in a breakout room. So there may be a bit of time that is needed for everyone to get the refreshments and use the facilities. So we'll say, shall we, 12:15. That should give time for all those who wish to give you questions to ask Ms Mordaunt to do so. Let me explain. In an inquiry, the counsel to the inquiry asks the questions except in very exceptional circumstances. Core participants have a right to ask her to consider asking questions, and that obviously requires a bit of time. To your left, there's a bank of lawyers, there are others in the building who will be fielding any questions that there may be. We have to give a chance for those core participants to play their part in what is a collaborative, participative process. So that's what we will do. We'll take a break then until 12:15.
And if you could give the normal advice to
I
the
will.
witness there, thank you.
You're giving evidence. You haven't finished, even though counsel has asked the questions she has for the moment. You must not discuss the evidence you have given or any question you think you may yet be asked to answer with anyone, whoever the anyone is. I look forward to seeing you back at 12:15. 12:15.
Ms Mordaunt, just 5 additional questions. Firstly, when writing to the then Chancellor in 2020 to advise him that you considered it inevitable that there would be substantial compensation, what did you envisage that might look like in terms of the scope of the compensation?
So I really didn't have a clear view on what that would be. It was clear to me at that time that redress would need to be made, but I didn't have in my mind a particular figure or scope, and I knew there was work needed to do that and work that out.
In light of what you've said about justice delayed and the impact of delay, and given what you told us about how the machinery of government works, are there processes within government for fast-tracking or at least speeding up decision-making on issues such as this?
So I think, for example, in moments of huge national crises like the pandemic, we brought forward legislation very quickly to do things that were necessary at the time. For example, suspending bits of health and safety on ports and other bits of legislation that were needed to ensure that things could work in very unusual sets of circumstances. That still takes a lot of time, and you can't bypass the processes legislation has to go through. I think in terms of this piece of work, I am not sure, I can only speak for my shift and the other bits that I know about, that we could have done it faster, particularly given the set of circumstances we were having to do it in with the backdrop of the pandemic. So there are ways of speeding up things, doing bits of work concurrently, but you can't bypass the processes. For example, if primary legislation is needed that you can go through. And I think that the COVID bill is as an example of that. That was an emergency piece of legislation. It was done at rapid speed, but it still took a fair bit of time to get through Parliament.
And leaving to one side legislation for these purposes, and this is a general question rather than specific to this issue, but would it be fair to say that pressure can be applied, prioritisation can be given to the speed with which, for example, civil servants are asked to come up with options or asked to turn things round, or the speed with which departments are asked to contribute to the ministerial right round and the signing up process. If there's enough political will, if there's something that the minister feels sufficiently strongly about, or has the ear of the most senior ministers in government, pragmatically that must be capable of making some kind of difference.
I think with any government you have priorities, that you have a lot of responsibility, responsible ultimately for everything, and in that you have to make choices and you can prioritise things, and of course that is the case. I would say in my current role, from what I'm aware of that's going on in government at the moment, we're about to go into the 4th and final session of legislation. I know that that's going to be a short session and there are carryover bills, whilst there are policy areas still to be resolved and not questions that I can answer on that. But what I can tell you is that in terms of this government and this Prime Minister's priorities going into that 4th session, this is one of his priorities.
Thank you. What impact does a high turnover of paymaster generals have on the government's ability to focus on this issue? And I say that in circumstances where the inquiry has heard quite a lot of evidence about ministerial turnover in earlier decades when decisions were being taken about measures in relation to safety and then response to infection, where ministerial turnover people have pointed to as a problem. Is that a problem in terms of the role of Paymaster General? We've had quite a few in the last few years.
I would say it's, in my experience, has been less of a problem than other ministerial roles. So to set it in context, I first became a minister in 2014. I've had 10 ministerial roles in that time period. What I would say with regard to Paymaster General, which is, although now sits in Cabinet, when I had the role I did not sit in Cabinet, so it was a middle-ranking minister, but it's usually someone fairly experienced who gets put in that role. And as a consequence, people who do that role, I think, take their responsibilities in terms of induction and handover to their successor seriously. And so I think probably, certainly in comparison to other ministerial posts that I have held in my time, this role had good continuity, and the types of things you're dealing with in this role, civil contingencies and resilience, for example, some of the most serious matters in government require that. So I felt that there was continuity in every aspect of this, of issue and of the imperative that was dealt with swiftly.
And then another theme that the inquiry has heard from earlier evidence is one of, if I can term it this way, institutional resistance. So I think Mr. Burnham, possibly in the speech we looked at earlier, but certainly in one of his speeches dealing with this issue, talked about, in his time as Secretary of State for Health, encountering resistance within the civil service, and he's not the only minister to have given evidence along those lines. The difficulty of moving the civil service machine quickly. Is that a state of affairs you recognise or can comment on in relation to the issue with which we're concerned?
That was not my experience, and I found my officials very motivated and also sharing the same view of as I do of that moral imperative to deliver. So that has not been my experience.
So those are the further questions I'm proposing to ask from the questions put forward to me by core participants. Do you have any questions for Ms. Mordaunt?
Yes, I do. Just a couple of areas, if I may. Lawrence, could we have up the compensation scheme? The reference to that is RLIT. Can you help me, Ms. Richards? 1129. RLIT 301129. No.
Is it the Sir Robert's, the terms of reference
yes.
you're looking for? We've got Sir Robert's study, which has the terms of reference, or we've got Mr. Ellis's announcement of them.
Sir Robert's study will be fine.
So that's
page 141.
RLIT 0002065.
Thank you. And if we go to internal page, I think it's 141. Let's go to 143. Go on, it's the terms of reference where he sets them out.
They are... so they're Appendix A, so they're a little before that.
It's page,
It's page 133 3.
Thank you.
Should be Lawrence. Appendix 1.
Thank you very much. Can I just ask you about these terms of reference? They met with your approval, as I understand, from what you've been saying. And I want to ask you about two things. First of all, where it says underneath the heading Independent Advice to Government, the term of reference approved was to give independent advice to the government regarding the design of a workable and fair framework for compensation for individuals infected and affected. Did you understand by affected those who did not have the infection themselves, but were very much affected by the infection of others, those that were partners or children or parents or those they cared for?
Yes, I did.
And I think you make a feature of that in your witness statement. I don't think we need to have it up, but you were talking there, this is paragraph 3, where you describe how you, as part of a government, needed to urgently address the disparity in financial support being offered across the 4 UK nations. Now, this is in relation directly to parity, but the words, I think, may be more general. It was thought this should be considered to address the fairness in any awards and should be across the board, addressing the broader issues of both the infected and the affected. And you go on to say, one of my main concerns, from your investigations, it did appear there was a severe disparity of assisting bereaved families, including partners who appeared to be severely disadvantaged. And you go on to talk about bereaved families and partners, and later on I think you deal with carers. So those were all categories of people that you felt needed to be included in a compensation scheme, were they?
Yes, there was, my thinking was that there were individuals that would need to be compensated because of loss that they had endured. There was also, for others, the issue of ongoing support and care, but I felt that compensation was wider than those direct issues. It was about loss incurred, and I was very aware that in addition to the initial injury caused by people being infected, the knock-on effects to their lives and their families' lives was very severe. I mentioned the lack of financial resilience people have. I think the day I came to listen to evidence you were hearing from a witness that not just because of what the injury done to him and his family, but also the lack of timeliness on support schemes, had lost his home as a consequence of that. So I think these are very complicated issues, and it is a combination of the initial injury people have suffered and the lack of action since, or lack of effectiveness of the support and consideration given to people, that has caused the very wide range of issues that this inquiry has had to grapple with. So although I didn't have a clear view of the shape of a scheme or how those issues would be addressed, or the interaction between support schemes and compensation schemes, I felt it was important that that wide scope was considered by Sir Robert's work.
And that's why you were asking him to consider not only those infected, but those affected as partners, members of the family, children, parents, and carers.
Correct.
And indeed, I needn't go on with the terms of reference. They reflect that, I think, in other ways too, quite apart from the little snippet which is on the screen. That's what I wanted to ask you about that. Next question really arises out of one of the questions that you've just been asked since the break by Ms. Richards. And it was about the compensation scheme, and you're telling us that the churn from one Paymaster General to the next, the short period that some of them may have been in post, didn't really make a difference. Can I just ask you perhaps the same question, but in this way? Why do you think it was you, on your watch, that set up the compensation scheme by Sir Robert Francis? Why you?
So I think the time frame I took over, that meeting in January had happened between my predecessor and the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State at the Department of Health. I think that was a key meeting where they were, I think, decided upon that this piece of work needed to be done. I very much felt that it needed to be done concurrently, and I certainly, my officials and other civil servants that I had spoken to were also of that view. I do think that my views that I've expressed today were shared by others in government, whether they be officials or ministers. It was a difficult time, and huge demands on resource from government in dealing with the pandemic. I would say that I was an experienced minister and was able to keep attention and pace on issues I needed to. But I think that there is nothing exceptional about me in delivering this. I do think that another minister with similar experience would have done the same thing.
Thank you.
Mr. Maxwell Scott, who represents Ms. Mordaunt, has no questions. So, Ms. Mordaunt, that's the end of the questions. Is there anything you would want to add?
I think just two things briefly, not wishing to repeat myself, but I think that this issue, as Leader of the House of Commons, is raised frequently and is a concern to many parliamentarians who will, even those that do not have direct casework from constituents, and there is a strong feeling that this needs to be resolved. And although as a Member of Parliament you know a little bit about a lot of things, I think it is not until you hear evidence or you're directly involved in cases that you really do appreciate what I've described as the layer on layer of injustice that people have suffered, from the original harm done to them, but then the impact on their life choices, the life choices of their family members, the stigma that many will have faced at the time when there were different attitudes to some of these issues. So I think that is the first thing that I, in my experience of being the minister responsible, have learned from this. And the other thing that I would say is, although I understand the scepticism people feel towards government, having had to endure many, many years of inaction on this issue, I think that the setting up of this inquiry and the work done since has been very important. And I certainly will, my small contribution to it, I think will, whenever I leave Parliament, will be something that I can be proud of.
Well, can I, for my part, thank you very much indeed for coming to give us this evidence. Those who are listening may understand why, as it happens, it may be serendipitous that we have started the week with your evidence. You set in train, or at least it was on your watch, that in train a compensation study was set up, which undoubtedly has raised expectations. And I'd like to thank you for telling us what you think your expectations were of that study, and for the time you have spent with us in the chair, as well as the time that you spent in the audience. Thank you.
So that concludes the evidence for today. Tomorrow we will be hearing, first of all, at 10 a.m. from Mr. Quinn, who is obviously the current Paymaster General, and then in the afternoon from Ms. Dunn, who is the second Permanent Secretary in the Department of Health and Social Care.
So tomorrow, a rather fuller day, 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock tomorrow.